Wait, how does this work?
You just press the button.
This one?
No, not that one.
You're listening to Press the Button, a Ploughshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security.
Everything seems impossible till it happens.
Everyone would be affected by a nuclear war.
Our government is planning to spend trillions of dollars to develop new nuclear weapons that we don't need.
You can't win a nuclear war.
We are all experts on nuclear weapons because we are all going to be affected by those nuclear weapons.
And here's your host, Joe Cirincione.
Thank you, Del, and welcome back to Press the Button. This is our 20th podcast.
We made it.
20. I know. We should have some fireworks. Can we have some sound effects for this?
I'm waiting for the ticker tape parade.
I'm Joe Cirincione, the president of Ploughshares Fund.
I'm Michelle Dover, director of programs.
And we are your co-hosts for these episodes. If you have missed any of the previous podcasts, you can go to our website, ploughshares.org. That's Plough, ploughshares.org, to download them, find out more about our work. We would welcome your support. As always, we're going to start out with a roundup of the nuclear news you need to know. Michelle, what do you have for us?
The news this week will include India, Iran at the G7, the U.S. missile launch, and, of course, whether or not you should use nuclear weapons against a hurricane.
Hurricanes and nukes.
Not a good idea.
Not a good idea. We'll get into that. I will also be interviewing Lynn Rusten, who is currently the vice president for the Nuclear Threat Initiative. She's a veteran of State Department, National Security Council, staff, and negotiator for, as it turns out, the very first START treaty that Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush negotiated, and the New START treaty that is under threat right now. But before we get to that, and right after the news, I answer a question.
Yes, all of those questions that people have been sending in. You finally get to hear what it's like to give Joe a cold question.
So it's a new feature. Write in, tell us what you think, and of course, send us your questions at press the button one word, at ploughshares.org, and listen to the podcast each Tuesday morning. We'll do one a week, and it could be yours. We'll do our best to keep this podcast to 30 to 40 minutes, the flight time of an ICBM. So let's get going. Michelle, bring us the news.
And now, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Welcome back to another early warning. I'm Michelle Dover, Director of Programs here at Ploughshares Fund. Today I am joined by my colleagues, our resident Roger Hale Fellow here at Ploughshares Fund, Catherine Killough, and Research Associate at the Federation of American Scientists, Matt Korda. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
And Matt, if I can just say, we're, one, excited to have you on. I know it's your first time on. And two, I know you just received a grant. You're part of the team that received one of our Women's Initiative grants from earlier this summer. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. I'm really excited about it.
So are we. Can't wait to see how the project goes. Okay, so I know I say this every week, but there's really a lot going on, and we do only have 7 minutes. So let's get started. Catherine. Iran's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, showed up at the G7 in a surprise visit this Sunday. It was a last-minute invitation from the French president, and it was basically a move straight out of a Real Housewives episode where he shows up, he's only meeting with France's foreign minister, not going to any of the formal G7 sessions, not meeting with any Americans, and some disagreement about who knew he was coming. But everyone's well aware that Macron, the French president, has been trying to diffuse the tensions between the U.S. and Iran. You've been following the U.S.-North Korea summitry and negotiations. Anything about this situation feel familiar?
Yeah, I can't help but wonder how Iran has been observing and taking lessons from the U.S.-North Korea diplomatic efforts in the past year. And I wonder if, Iran's surprise visit was maybe an attempt to take advantage of what they see as Trump's desire for media distraction, surprise summitry. And if that is true, if they were trying to appeal to Trump's senses, then this is a really sad indication of the state of international diplomacy today, all thanks to Trump and his reality TV style.
Yeah, and we're going to have to see if it does, if it does get down to substance, because, in order for these negotiations to work, to de-escalate, the U.S. and Iran are going to have to decide, is Iran allowed to legally export oil, which is right now the major sticking point. Matt, switching gears. A little over a week ago, the United States conducted a surprise launch of a Tomahawk missile that traveled a distance of more than 500 kilometers, according to DoD. And so if the INF treaty still existed, this would have been a violation. You just wrote a piece on this, and in which you said that the interesting part of it was that this type of launcher, it's the same launcher that the Russians have been decrying as a violation of INF for years. So why would the U.S. use this launcher?
So essentially, for political reasons, right? So as you say, it's the same kind of launcher. This is something that the Russians have been complaining about for some time. They say that the type of launcher that was used on Sunday is exactly the same one that's deployed in Europe. The U.S. says that they're different, right? So it is, it's kind of easy to get lost in the talking points between Russia and the United States on this one. When you have these competing narratives about what the launcher actually represents. Sunday's launch doesn't exactly prove either way, right? So we don't really know what the internal schematics of the launcher are, but it definitely doesn't help kind of diffuse the arms race at all. And in my opinion, it's not really worth it just to kind of give the corpse of the INF treaty the middle finger. So.
Matt, did you see North Korea's recent statement after one of their projectile launches where they actually condemned the U.S. missile launch? I think it goes to your point that, we see with countries like North Korea, they feel justified in their pursuit of nuclear weapons and missile testing when they see the U.S. Conducting tests of this scale.
Oh, absolutely. And, there's a great point there about China as well, right? So China can essentially feel totally vindicated about its decision not to join in on arms control talks here, because why would it do that when it has so fewer weapons than both the United States and Russia? And, now Russia and India and now the United States are all developing these same types of missiles. So it's really interesting to see how different countries have been responding to this latest U.S. test.
Speaking of India, Catherine, I don't know if you saw recently, the defense minister of India said that he remained firmly committed to the doctrine of no first use for nuclear weapons, but that what happens in the future depends on the circumstances. And he said this while he was at the range where India has tested some of its weapons. And just in case we thought it might have been a fluke, he reiterated it in a tweet. Why would he say this now? What do you make of it?
Yes, I did see this, and I think we need to remember that this statement comes on the heels of India's decision to revoke Kashmir's special status and its autonomy. And I think reading it in this context, we see how India feels emboldened to escalate crises and push the limit with regard to regional confrontations by relying on their, the threat of nuclear conflict. I think it's also interesting, I can't help but observe the U.S. double standard here in that we're, condemning countries like North Korea for their nuclear development, but we're pretty much staying mum on this actual nuclear conflict.
Well, and if anything, seeing the photo op, bringing it full circle, seeing the photo op with Trump and Modi at the G7, it seems to provide this blessing for India to continue these actions, even though the U.S. has stated and would typically act in a more kind of broker role to try to reduce tensions.
Right.
So before we wrap up for today, the story that was in everyone's inbox this morning, Trump has suggested multiple times to senior Homeland Security and national security officials that they explore using nuclear bombs to stop hurricanes from hitting the United States. Okay, I get that everyone is laughing at Trump for this, but it's actually not a new question. And to me, it seems that this is just another example of Americans looking at nuclear weapons as a silver bullet or a problem solver. You know, if Hollywood can use it to fix our asteroid problems, like, let's fix our hurricane problems. I don't know, Catherine, Matt, what do you guys think?
Well, this is something that actually the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration took up years ago. So you can go to their website. They have an FAQ on why it's not a good idea to throw nukes at a hurricane. I mean, it's essentially, throwing radioactivity at a huge fan is not the best solution.
Oh, God, yeah.
Yeah, and, you know, I really do love this story because, you know, every time President Trump wants to do something kind of wacky with nuclear weapons, it means that, you know, our community gets to have, I think, a really important discussion about sole authority as it relates to nuclear launches, right? So right here in this situation, we have a president who wants to launch a nuclear weapon at a hurricane. It's a terrible idea for a number of reasons, but institutionally, there's nothing really in place to stop him in the same way that in the middle of a nuclear crisis where, you know, clarity surrounding, you know, intelligence and things like that is a lot more murky. There's nothing to stop him there either, right? And so this is something that I think we need to be thinking about anytime the president decides to do something kind of wacky with nuclear weapons.
And with that, our time is up. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Letters, we get letters. We get stacks and stacks of letters.
We are back with another Q&A segment of Press the Button, where we take the questions from you, our listeners, and give them to Joe, who
Letters. We get letters. We get lots and lots of letters.
And unfortunately, that reference just goes right over my head.
Come on. David Letterman used to say this on his show, and he got it from Perry Como, who, I don't know, maybe 60 years ago used it on his black and white, very popular Perry Como show.
I recognize one of those two names. Henry from Tennessee. Henry is asking, if an agreement is not brokered by the end of the year between the U.S. and North Korea, what do you expect from North Korea as a response? Do you think long-range flight tests will resume, more nuclear explosive tests, possibly above ground? Do their recent tests of a new solid-fueled short-range missile and demonstrations of their submarines concern you?
Yes, absolutely. Henry, thank you very much. So Kim Jong-un has said that he's giving Trump till the end of the year to respond, to get a negotiated deal. If we do not have a deal, I think the U.S. is more or less willing to accept the status quo, to let it drift. But I don't think North Korea is. I think they're going to press for this. Kim Jong-un is like the Glenn Close character in Fatal Attraction. He will not be ignored. You think it's just going to go away? It's not going to go away. Look at the short-range rocket tests that he's done just in the last few weeks. I think he'll renew long-range missile tests. And you know what? He has to. A number of analysts, like our friend Jeffrey Lewis, think that he has the nuclear capability. I agree. They think that he has the ICBM capability. I'm not so sure. 2 tests do not a missile program make. Historically, countries have had to conduct at least 9 long-range tests before they could have confidence that even 50% of their rockets would work. I don't think Kim can have confidence that he actually has a long-range deterrent force against the U.S. without more tests. I bet his military is pressing him for more tests. I think you'll see it in 2020 if we are not in negotiations.
A reminder of really the gravity of these issues. World ending.
I'll try to be a little lighter next time, Michelle.
Thank you, Joe.
I'm delighted to be here with Lynn Rusten, who is the Vice President for Global Nuclear Policy at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, NTI, as we all know it. She has a long career in this field. From 2003 to 2008, she was a senior professional staff member of the Senate Armed Services Committee. Later, she played an integral role in the negotiation and ratification of the new START Treaty when she was serving as the Senior Director for Arms Control and Nonproliferation in the Obama administration's White House National Security Council staff and at the Department of State, including as Chief of Staff for the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's all these very long titles that you've acquired in your field. How did you get started in this field?
So, first of all, thanks for having me on, Joe, and enjoy your podcast. I'm pleased to be participating in it. So I will date myself and tell you that I was in college in the late 70s. I went to Oberlin College, and although I started out as an English major, I switched to government, otherwise known as political science, and I came under the tutelage of a wonderful man named George Lanyi, who taught Soviet foreign policy. And so from there, I developed a real interest in the Soviet Union and Soviet foreign policy. I went on to, I actually studied Russian at Leningrad State University.
Really?
Yes, I said Leningrad, not St. Petersburg.
Yes.
And I went on to the University of Michigan, and I got a graduate degree in Russian and East European Studies. And my very first job was at Common Cause, when they were active on these issues with SANE and some of the other advocacy groups.
And you ended up working on the original START Treaty, the one that Ronald Reagan started and George H.W. Bush concluded. How did you do that?
So I landed a job at what was then the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency, and I was working on the original START Treaty. I came in at the end in the last year, and I was involved in the backstopping process in Washington and then on the negotiating delegation in Geneva, and I was there when we finished the treaty. In round-the-clock negotiating sessions.
Boy.
Yeah.
And so I'm going to jump you forward to another period.
Yep.
You were also involved in the new START Treaty. So
I was.
This is the one that Barack Obama started negotiating in 2009. What was your involvement there?
Exactly. So I actually, Rose Gottemiller brought me into the State Department when she was the Assistant Secretary. They were looking to reconstitute some of the expertise and experience that had been lost over the last 8 years or so, where people had who had been involved in this were no longer in the State Department. And so I ended up leading the interagency backstopping process that supported the negotiation.
Tell me a little bit about the Nuclear Threat Initiative for people who don't know what it is.
Sure. So the Nuclear Threat Initiative is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization in Washington that's dedicated to working internationally to reduce the risks of use and spread of what we call weapons of mass destruction and disruption. And the disruption part refers to cyber, really. We are not a conventional think tank in that our primary product isn't reports and analysis, although we certainly do that.
Yes.
And we're not really just an advocacy group either. We work on a model where we work both with governments and with non-governmental entities, and to some extent we're trying to work towards systemic change, or we try to incubate ideas and then hand them over.
So now let me get into the details of New START.
Great.
And this, we were deeply involved here at Ploughshares Fund in supporting your efforts. You were on the inside and we were helping with the outside game, which is the sort of role we think of ourselves in at Ploughshares, which turned out to be critical because it was a close call. There was fierce opposition to ratifying this relatively modest treaty. It didn't change a lot. It was extending the START agreement that you would help, the process you would help start when you were in the George H.W. Bush administration. We all thought this was going to be an easy push, but instead, John Kyle took control of the opposition and dragged it out until the very last day of the Senate in December 2010. And then it was only 71 votes. And you need 67 votes to ratify the treaty. So this was a long slog.
It really was, and that wasn't I don't think any of us anticipated that when we negotiated the treaty and started to ratify it, and there are definitely lessons learned there on a number of fronts. But the treaty is vitally important. I mean, since 1972, we have had, by and large, a series of agreements between us and Russia, formerly the Soviet Union, by which we mutually agreed to limit our nuclear arms competition by putting at first a cap on the number of systems, and then over time actually reducing them to include provisions and some of these treaties that would try to encourage more stabilizing force structures on each side.
What does that mean?
So that means you want to, basically it's all about reducing the risk that these things will ever be used.
Mm-hmm.
And so you want to reduce the incentive for one side to use a nuclear weapon. And so
strike first.
To strike first. And so, but it's not just about the limits, and it's not just about the force structure. I mean, what's really critical is it provides verification and transparency. So each side, A, can confirm that the other is complying, and both sides are complying with the New START treaty. And you get a lot of insight into what each side is doing. I mean, each of our countries can conduct 18 on-site inspections a year in the other country. I don't think people realize it's going on right now.
Right. Russians come here, we go there.
Exactly. We literally go to bases. We single out a specific missile and said, you said there's 4 warheads on top of that thing. Pull off the top and show me the bumps. Yeah, exactly. And by the way, that's an innovation that wasn't in the original START treaty. And so what that does is not only does it give you confidence that the treaty itself is being complied with, but it gives you, if the treaty is of a certain duration, it gives you a long-term planning horizon on which, we know what the other side's going to do, and so, we can plan accordingly. We don't have to worry that they're going to, deploy lots more weapons or do certain things that would then force us to react in negative ways.
Which is why the military historically has supported these agreements.
Totally.
It gives you predictability and it gives you verification.
And frankly, it lets them spend money on the things that military planners think are more useful to them, which are the weapons that we actually occasionally use in war.
Right, the U.S. is involved in seven
stuff.
wars right now. We have a lot of money that we're spending on those wars. If you don't have to spend money on redundant nuclear systems, why would you? And if a treaty lets you keep those expenses down, that helps your military cause. That improves the security of the country.
Absolutely.
And so the New START treaty, however, despite the obviously strong case you just laid out for it, is in jeopardy. This treaty expires. People don't realize this about most arms control treaties. Most arms control treaties have an expiration date. In this case, it's 2021.
Yes, so the New START was negotiated with a 10-year duration, which will expire in February of 2021. But it also includes a provision that says that the treaty can be extended for another 5 years by mutual agreement. And because the Senate and the Russian parliament ratified the treaty with those words in it, it means you don't have to go back to either parliament. It can just be done by the 2 presidents.
Right. Stroke of a pen,
exactly.
2 pens, and it's done.
Exactly. Very easy. And it should be done. It should be done to preserve all the things we just talked about, the limits, the verification, the predictability. And there's no negotiations underway now.
So why does John Bolton say what he's saying, that he wants to include China, or Tom Cotton, that he wants to, we got to bring China in. China has 300 nuclear weapons. The New START treaty talks about thousands on each side.
Look,
and why does it say we have to bring in, is this all a ruse?
I think I think there's clearly a worldview of some who think that the United States benefits more from a lack of constraint on ourselves than we do from accepting constraints on ourselves to have constraint on a country like Russia. I mean, they just think we don't need it. I think it's very short-sighted. And there's also some internal inconsistencies because on the one hand, there's stated, the same people state concerns about some of the developments, weapons that Russia is pursuing on the one hand, and yet they don't seem to see the benefit of keeping Russia in a treaty like New START. And by the way, and specifically, there are the new nuclear weapons that President Putin has talked about. Some have used and talked about developing, one of which may be connected to this, accident that just happened in Russia. First of all, most of those systems are so far out in terms of their development that they will not come into deployment during the life of the New START treaty, even if it's extended for 5 years. That's point one.
Good
and
point.
Frankly, a test failure like that shows you it is a long way from being ready for deployment. Number two of the systems that they're developing clearly would fall under New START without any discussion, including this new Sarmat heavy ICBM, which will replace the old one, although even that it's not clear. It's slipping in its timeline for deployment. And the hypersonic system that's going to be on an SS-19. So the fact is the treaty itself, will allow you to have some insight into, and they'll fall under the limits of the treaty. For some of these systems, some of them are unlikely to come into force, and some of them really have nothing to do with strategic arms control, and they should be a subject of discussion for future negotiation, and also for the broader issues of just strategic stability.
If this administration does not take action to extend New START, and a new president is elected in November, can she still save the treaty? Will there be enough time?
Well, it's a pretty tight timeline, but in principle, given a transition period too, if the current administration doesn't withdraw from New START, you could imagine a president-elect expressing an intention, or maybe it probably would have been part of a platform.
Mm-hmm.
And so you could, it's kind of a Hail Mary pass at the end, but you could envision a situation where it is at the last minute extended. I think we'd be in a far better position if this president did this on a bipartisan basis with the support of Congress. And I actually have no doubt in my mind, I think if the president and the administration signaled that it was going to extend New START, I don't think you'd have much opposition.
Right.
I really don't, because I think most people understand the logic of keeping this in place.
If a new president is elected, one of the jobs that she or he's going to have is going to be reconstructing a nuclear policy for the United States and fixing the damage that this administration has done. And I actually think this is one of our most urgent tasks. And to be able to do that, you have to really start now, thinking about what those policies should be, at least the broad frameworks, filling it out, so by the time a president is elected, there is not only a platform, but there's actually sort of a plan, of how you're going to do this, who's going to do it. So one of the reasons I was so anxious to have you come on is to have you tell us about your experiences with the Obama administration, and knowing what we know now, what should we do different? How should the next president prepare for a new nuclear posture for the United States of America?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of lessons learned. First of all, it's obviously helpful that for whatever a president-elect has, whatever positions they've taken and spoken about in the campaign, in an area that's a policy. First of all, this should be a policy priority, right? I mean, nuclear policy is inherently presidential, and so it's very important that any president, put their stamp on this policy, direct it, and make sure that the policy they want is created and implemented. So that really starts with the campaign. I mean, I hope all candidates should be explaining what their views and policies are in this area, and of course, then whoever wins the election, has a some measure of support for the things they've started to articulate. Number one. Number two, I think people really, it does matter, the people that you select. Maybe before that, I should say, as I said already, I mean, presidential priority and focus has to be clear.
Yes.
And then you need to have the right people, not only in the White House and the NSC, but also in key places in the agencies. And they need to understand what the president's priorities are.
We had Ben Rhodes and John Wolfstall on talking about this, and that was high on their list of lessons learned. Staffing, getting the right people in the right positions who could carry out the president's program, whether the president was watching them or not.
Yeah, exactly. But the president also does have to watch, or at least make clear that it's a priority. I do think process is important. And being, I think it's real. I mean, I do have a lot of experience running interagency processes in this area, and I think it's important to make sure that all the agencies and equities feel like they've been voiced and understood and taken into account, especially in issues that are hard and sensitive, where ultimately there's going to be a decision by the president, takes in all that information, and ultimately, they're going to be winners and well, hopefully the country's a winner, but in terms of interagency politics and equities, there'll be winners and losers. I also think you've just got to really keep an eye toward outside constituencies. Congress, of course, is essential. Look, the way the Obama administration negotiated the Iran deal was really, very carefully and almost brilliantly executed in terms of the negotiation. I mean, I know there's not everyone agrees with that. I think it was
most
an excellent
experts
deal.
do. I mean, in the national security community, there's overwhelming support among the experts for
there
this.
Was such
it's really a
discipline.
small minority that disagrees with the quality and
I don't think
usefulness
anybody
of this
did.
deal.
Some people will not agree, right? And
yeah.
But the attention to the presidential focus, the discipline of the process, the constant communication with Congress, and of course it was an international diplomatic endeavor, and so there are the outside constituencies too. I mean, in terms of not just Congress, but other, your allies, your other partners. I mean, all of that has to be, factored in.
Yes. Okay. Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
Let me interrupt you just for a second as you go through the rest of your list. But when you do that kind of consulting and you talk about equities, well, the trouble is a lot of the other people's equities go against your national security interests. For example, a lot of the states where they build ICBMs have equities in maintaining those bases, build and store them. And you ran up against this in New START. You must have. If I understand, when the president wanted to set a number, what the number was, the New START Treaty limits both sides to 1,550 operationally deployed strategic systems, long-range missiles and bombers. Got it. But if he went too low, he was going to cut into the support of key senators whose vote he needed, who had ICBMs based in their states. So that's being participatory, you're being inclusive, you're dealing with their equities, but don't those equities cut against the lower number that the Obama administration originally sought?
There's no question that kind of sort of pork barrel politics and considerations is a huge problem. I mean, that's why we can't get another round of BRAC, of base realignment and closure, right?
States don't want to close bases.
States don't want to close bases, even though the Pentagon desperately wants to rationalize its base structure and save money. So it's clearly challenging. There's not a simple solution on that. I do think one of the lessons of New START for me is I think the Obama administration thought we'd have a second bite at the apple. I mean, the idea was that, and this goes back to the START too. I mean, there was great concern because the original START treaty had lapsed, and so there was no verification, right? And so there was a great desire to get New START in place quickly, with the idea that you could then do another more ambitious treaty, later in the president's term, optimistically hoping for 2 terms at that point. And that proved to be wrong, because New START was so much more challenging than anyone ever thought to get ratified, when it shouldn't have been, because it actually is an important but fairly modest agreement, in that it didn't really, it didn't bring, the levels of systems and weapons down that far, but it did extend really important verification. And so there's a lesson there, which is take your time and try to get the most ambitious agreement you want, because you're probably only going to get one bite at the apple, and that comes at the beginning of the term. The other is another disadvantage of not extending New START now is you're more likely to create a situation in the future where there's kind of a rush to get something in place, rather than giving us time to get a better and more ambitious deal, whatever that is, whether it's additional weapon types. I don't think we can get China right now into agreement with U.S. and Russia, because our the levels of systems are so different. But you just end up putting unnecessary pressure on yourself. And
so the new president has to understand this. They got to have a game plan to understand what they're going to be up against, and be thinking 3-4 moves ahead.
Yeah, any president.
Thank you very much. Let me ask you one more question before we have to end this, which is your overall assessment of where we are right now in nuclear security. How dangerous is it, and how optimistic are you about our ability to make it safer?
So I think we're in a really dangerous moment, because in some ways we're going in the wrong direction. First of all, the state of the bilateral relationship with Russia is really bad. We have very little dialogue. We have no serious dialogue on strategic stability. We're not really having a productive dialogue on arms control, be it extending New START, and thinking more broadly about how are we going to start to address these new technologies and how they're affecting even the stability of deterrence. We have an administration whose policies are, instead of the steady movement toward reducing the role of nuclear weapons in our national security policy, seems to be going backward in time and actually expanding the potential uses for nuclear weapons. Mm-hmm. So that's a very unproductive and dangerous development. And meanwhile, we've got things like cyber risks to nuclear command and control. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got things that call into question the reliability and the assumptions. I mean, we count on everything going right, no one miscalculating, and nuclear weapons not being used, right?
Yes.
And instead, we've got the speed of military things like hypersonics is increasing, the decision time is reduced, there's a lack of dialogue, there's a lack of understanding of what each side is doing and planning. And so it's a dangerous moment that's going in the wrong direction, and the United States is no longer leading. We need to be leading in terms of reducing the role of nuclear weapons, promoting nonproliferation, working with allies and partners around the world, not just on this, but just even more broadly in terms of our approach to international security and foreign policy. And I don't believe in the construct of a period of increasing great power competition. I don't think that's the right frame for our national security policy.
I couldn't agree more. And there's a whole lot more I want to ask you about what you just said, including the NTI study that concluded that a cyber attack could be a serious threat to U.S. nuclear command and control, either compromising our ability to launch, or compromising our ability to not launch, or compromising our intelligence to understand what the threat is. But we are out of time. So I want to thank you very much for coming in, Lynn, and sharing your expertise, and I want to get you to promise to come back again so we can continue the conversation.
Thank you, Joe. I look forward to it.
Great.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil and Zach Brown. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Research by Alex Spire. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit ploughshares.org.